The left is always inclined to look on the grim side of things. Always inclined to look on the grim side of things. The cup is always half empty. Until you point out, look, it's half full. It doesn't look so bad.
Welcome to Political Gingervitis, the crazy and zany podcast for progressives who need a laugh. I'm your hostess with the mostest, Andrew Stewart, and this week we're going to try to put a smile on your face and maybe a few thoughts in your head.
The other thing, along with the fundamental target of creative liberty, is allies. I sometimes think that our crowd is a little closed off as to who you can work with. For example, the libertarians. Now, the libertarians are not great on everything. Like I often say to them, I'd be with you on something, your views on child slavery I don't totally approve of. What do you mean? I say, well, you're in favor of no laws and restraints on exploitation, in the interest of the free market. So you want to put a little anklet around a kid of 9 and make him pull a coal trolley down a mine? Well, I don't really mean that. But libertarians are good on some things. They don't like wars. Some of the best stuff on intervention on the war on terror, if you go to antiwar.com, which is a libertarian site, you'll read great stuff.
Our job is to discuss the rise of movements that challenge repressive institutions and discourses. Any kind of discussion like that has to talk about who is the enemy and what is the enemy up to and what are the people's forces doing about that enemy and his shenanigans. Who are the allies and who are the potential allies of the people. And we have to decide what forces can usefully be called part of the people's movement.
Welcome back to Political Gingervitis. I'm your host, Andrew Stewart, and we today are continuing our series in regards to the question of a new united front that can be formed in opposition to both Trumpism and neoliberalism. So today we are going to jump right into it, and first up, for a little historical background, we have returning to the show as a guest, Dr. David Abraham, the scholar of Weimar Germany and the history of the German descent into the fascist regime of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Following that, we are going to talk with the great scholar of W.E.B. Du Bois, Dr. Tony Montero, who is going to explain what exactly is, and more importantly, what is not fascism in America today. So stick around, because I promise that this episode is going to be particularly interesting. So we've seen some very fascinating developments in the last year, and the constant trope that's brought up in discussion is the Weimar Republic and how Hitler came to power, and the kind of fulcrum of that was the refusal of the German Communist Party to create a united front with the Social Democrats and to oppose the Nazis. And I wanted to kind of start off because I think this is pertinent to our current situation and discussion. Mm-hmm. There's kind of a story or history that we've learned throughout the last couple decades that's designed around this kind of sectarian, exclusive attitude that the communists had that was counterproductive and ultimately just the designs of Moscow, but the discourse they were engaging in was they opposed the German Social Democrats because of their attitudes on colonialism and the failings of what they called the Two and a Half International to thoroughly repudiate racism. And, you know, you see W.E.B. Du Bois in his letter to Gus Hall, he talks about how the Socialist Party was making common cause with Jim Crow. And I think that's a very interesting point.
Right. Well, I think much of that is true. It's quite harsh. I think the consensus amongst Germans about imperialism in the 1920s was pretty wall to wall. There certainly were some left-wing intellectuals, unaffiliated, some in the Communist Party, who appreciated that imperialism is not just something done to the people in Namibia or Tanganyika or elsewhere, but was an element brought back home, and which was visible in the language of Minderwertigkeit, of less valuable races, Black, Slavic, Semitic, Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, it's absolutely true. Our sensitivity in the early 21st century to issues of race should not be transposed 100 years or practically 100 years back. It would be, I think, a little unfair. I mean, we do have serious efforts by socialists and communists alike to understand imperialism. They did not focus on the racial aspects of it. Certainly, that was one of the weaknesses, but I don't think we should go too far in discrediting the efforts they made to understand imperialism because they didn't have our sensitivity to issues of race. Du Bois, of course, is an outlier at this point in his appreciation of both the role of class and property relations and race relations and the way in which they interacted with each other, what today is the politics of intersectionality on everyone's lips. But that said, there are many things that made Nazi success possible. One of them, you are right, is the failure of socialists and communists to be able to work together at critical moments. You're also right that the bulk of the literature blames the communists, and it does so unfairly, I think. Among other things, the concept of social fascism, which seems to most ears so implausible today, was much less implausible at the time for a number of reasons. Number one, Keynesianism gave capitalism and with it social democracy an incredible boost that nobody could have predicted. The rise of consumer capitalism, of mass consumption, mass production, the ability to move the social struggle from a distributional one to a growth one. So the famous American version, of course, was don't fight over the size of the slices of the pie, just keep growing the pie. So I think no working class movement in the 1920s could have anticipated the kind of stabilization that Keynesian growth economics could produce.
Right.
And we saw that after the war in what the French call the glorious 30 years. Now, it's true that the destruction of World War II made Keynesianism easier when you have to rebuild from the ground up. And you can pay workers more and solve the unemployment problem in a way that no one could anticipate in the 1920s.
Right.
So the notion that the Social Democrats would be boosting capitalism, helping capitalism survive, is very plausible from the standpoint of 1930, more or less around 1930. there is nothing in this really for the workers because capitalism couldn't possibly provide workers hope or goods.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that that was not so true. It was not so true if you include war and destruction in the Keynesianism. There were aberrant social democrats who argued for massive employment, job creating measures, Arbeitsbeschaffungspolitik, as they called it at the time. But that came mostly from the trade unions, not from the Social Democratic Party.
Okay. So the reason I bring that up is there's a lot of conversation that's emerging around the notion of alliances. Are Americans of the progressive end of the spectrum supposed to try to work within the Democratic Party, or should they try to form a new politics? And then simultaneous with that is things that Ralph Nader has pointed out, for instance,
Right.
where you have a vast majority of the public, people who call themselves progressives, but also the libertarian types who are in favor of things like auditing the Pentagon or climate change preparation. And he points out basically these two parties manipulate their bases to prevent them from working together.
Right.
And that's where the question of alliances in today's circumstances and building these sorts of united fronts or popular fronts develops.
Right. Well, I mean, it's interesting that you invoke Nader because however one might feel about him, there's no question that in a proportional representation parliamentary system, he would have been a kingmaker in his day, not today, but in his day, he would have been a kingmaker rather than a spoiler. So, of course, the Bush-Gore election had a lot of, I don't know if we want to say liberals, Democrats, progressives, whatever, blaming Nader for being a spoiler.
Right.
Whereas in a proportional representation system, he would have been the kingmaker. Gore would have become president, and he would have had to commit himself to a left liberal greenish program of the kind that Nader stood for. I was myself a member of something called the New Party back in the 1980s. The effort was to establish a third party which would cross-endorse progressive Democrats. The theory being that the American system would not tolerate a real third party, but it might be possible to nominate worthy liberal left Democrats who would then know, or for that matter, not necessarily even left liberal Democrats, but Democrats who would know that they owed their victory to the left.
Right.
Why? Because here the votes that put you over the top came from this new party. Well, the Supreme Court struck that down in an opinion, I believe, written by Rehnquist, struck that, although I would have to check whether Rehnquist authored the opinion, but Twin Cities New Party versus Edmonds is the name of the opinion. And it's very interesting because the Supreme Court more or less said that the political parties are private entities and it's up to them whom they want to have vote for their candidates, and that their candidates were not available to the public except through the parties. So it was a very interesting way of saying that there are two private entities in the United States that run the political system.
Right.
The Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and you go with them or you don't go at all. Very interesting, underappreciated statement of the rules of the game.
And a very fascinating one.
So that brings us to, there have been a series of efforts to create labor parties, left parties in the United States. In the period of the New Deal, we had the Communist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Socialist Labor Party, groups that were able to use the spirit of the times to get in the high one digits, sometimes into the two digits. In this era of money-dominated politics, I don't see the possibility of a serious third party. So that brings us back to the question of whether the Democratic Party is a vehicle which could be used or stolen or hijacked or transformed for progressive politics. You have people like Bernie Sanders who say, I am not a Democrat, capital D, Democrat, but I will use the Democratic Party, the primary process that the Democratic Party is obligated to push progressive candidates as far as possible through the Democratic Party mechanism. He himself was, in my view, a real, how should I put it, a phenomenon unto himself, sui generis. I don't know if that could be repeated again. But it is true that we are seeing something now in the Democratic Party that might allow for a progressive possibility. Of all people, Ross Douthat, the conservative columnist in the New York Times, had a very interesting column, which was mostly about the problems of the Republican Party, but he did talk about how the Democrats could respond to the moment. And he said that there were three Democratic parties. There's a Democratic Party of identity politics, there was a Democratic Party of class politics, and there was a Democratic Party of Trump-Russia politics. And that the identity politics group, Clinton, was so committed to not allowing class politics to emerge that it would throw all of its weight behind an endless Trump-Russia politics in order to set the agenda for the next congressional and presidential elections. So I think that's right. There is a battle in the Democratic Party, and for the progressives to win is going to require joining forces with the kind of independent people that you mentioned at the start of your question.
Right.
Can that be done successfully remains an open question. Can the Sanders phenomenon be repeated, and will people take seriously some of the things he said? So, for example, at one point he got into big trouble. I don't remember if it was an interview or debate where he talked about the Democratic Party establishment. And he was referring, obviously, to Wall Street and obviously to Hollywood, but he was also referring to groups like Planned Parenthood that make the discussion, for example, of abortion a closed issue in the Democratic Party. You cannot, and he got in trouble with this in Omaha a few weeks ago, with his support and Keith Ellison's support for a very left populist mayoral candidate who did not. He was not anti-abortion, but he refused to put so-called choice at the top of his agenda. And this candidate, as well as Sanders, caught hell because this is the issue around which the suburban middle class is organized on behalf of the Democratic Party. And if you're going to move to a class-based politics, you're going to have to make some concessions to working class people for whom the issue of abortion is not so crystal clear and will never be so crystal clear as it is for the liberal suburban upper middle class, for whom this has become a totem, an icon. It's the version of personal liberty which used to belong to the Republicans, but it's now a suburban Democratic commitment. So there will be some tough issues that have to be fought inside the Democratic Party if it is to become the vehicle for progressive politics.
Right. So, do you have any thoughts in relation to the difference between a united front versus a popular front? Because, I mean, those two strategies had a serious impact on world history.
Right. So, terms that evolved 80 years ago are hard to transplant and set down on the current scene. certainly the French politics that we saw in the last few weeks uh, is kind of reminiscent of the Popular Front agenda, but in a super diluted form. I mean, Mr. Macron is no Leon Blum.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, he's not a social democrat, let alone a socialist. And so the fear of fascism, or if that's what the National Front is, um, today leads people to settle, people on the left to settle for very, very little. Um, I do wish that Mélenchon had made some kind of offer, instead of just saying, well, you can stay home if you want, just don't vote for Le Pen. He didn't propose some kind of joint effort the way that communists and socialists did in the first Mitterrand election.
Right.
So, are there conditions under which the left should abandon any demands, or does a Popular Front always require, as I think it should, some minimum for us too?
Right.
Not just for Macron, but for us too.
Right. And do you see any situation where, I mean, I know this is almost hair splitting, but a united front as opposed to a Popular Front strategy is possible to be laid out in America?
Well, I hope we don't get to that point, in particular because I don't see any part of the Republican Party joining some kind of ralliement, some kind of Popular Front or United Front. I mean,
Right. I mean, the element that strikes me as one is not as much the Republicans as the Libertarians, who do have a significant caucus within the Republican Party.
well, that remains to be seen. Yes, they do have a significant caucus, but at least in Trump, they have someone who's not going to go out and attack gay marriage, gay people. He may make an appointment or two, a la Jeff Sessions, of people who are in that hyper social reactionary mode. But I don't know about the libertarians in the Republican Party. I haven't heard them say a word about Sessions' new war on crime redux. I mean, just today he ordered federal prosecutors to go after the maximum drug sentences, even for the smallest drug offense. So, that I thought around Rand Paul and people like that, we were seeing the beginning of some effort to back away from the war on crime, war on drugs, whether they associated that with racial disparities or not. But at least in this incarnation, I haven't heard those voices yet.
Right. And I mean, Nader does point out that, the co-opting is of such language is a major issue with the Republicans and how they utilize that discourse for some very non-libertarian ends.
Right, and we'll have to see. I mean, I'm not a environment or energy expert, anything but certainly some kind of coalition, Popular Front, United Front effort on the environmental front would certainly include hardcore capitalist notions like market trading of pollution, the right to pollute, at least as a short-term element within a longer-term alternative energy strategy. So let them step forward. I mean, let somebody step forward from that corner.
Right. So one idea, I was watching a speech with Adolf Reed where he describes how the discourse within the black civil rights movement evolved from what he terms as a popular front politics to a anti-colonial discourse by the time of the Black Power movement, and how that impacted the militancy of the movement. I was wondering if you had any thoughts as reflections on that, both as somebody who observed those developments or
Right.
as a law professor.
Well, I greatly respect the work of Adolph Reed, and he has been unflinching in his insistence that there is a class politics to civil rights in the broadest sense understood, and within the black community, and that Du Bois's legacy has proven to cut both ways, as lawyers like to say. On the one hand, the talented tenth notion has created a black bourgeoisie, a black middle class, but it has succumbed to many of the temptations of middle class concerns, so that we can see, certainly on campuses today, this incredible obsession with disparity at the expense of inequality. So that, and many of the people who use that language are the same people who make fun of color blindness and equal protection as mystifications of oppression, which they might be, but at the same time they insist on disparity as the key sin of our society. Racial disparity is the key sin of our society. They have failed to pay attention to inequality, and I think Reed has been very insistent on this, and I strongly endorse his analysis and his politics for that reason. As to the historical shift to what at the time was considered, I don't think the word anti-colonial was used quite as often as it is today, but third worldism was the word much more in fashion at the time. Anti-imperialist, yes, but a kind of third world liberation is strategy, and for obvious reasons that are not just analytically obvious, but made political sense as well. The third world was in motion. There was a war in Vietnam. There were struggles all over Latin America. People had not yet forgotten who Patrice Lumumba was. And Angola and Mozambique and other communist-led, but nonetheless national liberation movements in Africa, in Asia, and even at that time, the South African movement had a very clearly left leadership. So to try to insert the U.S. movement of Black Americans into an international struggle made a great deal of sense, and that struggle scored some successes, built out the movement in some ways, but perhaps missed some chances for coalition in the United States, which we heard in the last speeches of Martin Luther King before he was assassinated, when he was talking about poor people's movements, when he was talking about labor movements. You know, after all, most of our students are familiar with the 1963 March on Washington speeches. They haven't heard the speeches to the sanitation workers of Memphis. You know? So I think the turn to a global anti-colonial politics or anti-imperialist politics, third world politics, in some respects produced more militancy, but in other respects it missed a lot of opportunities that might have been available in the United States itself.
Right. Because we're seeing with Black Lives Matter and elements within it, there's definitely an internationalist orientation in terms of, like, for instance, you see from Ferguson to Palestine as kind
Right.
of this meme
Right.
or hashtag thing, but it seems to also have an aspect that is not as confrontational. The movement for Black Lives issues, this platform of things that it's looking for, and it's working towards what Reed is articulating more. What are you seeing on your campuses, I guess, is my question.
Well, I mean, I cannot speak for too many campuses. I'm only familiar with a few, but I'm not sure one can describe Black Lives Matter really as a movement. There are a few intellectuals, and there are lots of local chapters, and there are some people who are getting grants and money from foundations and very the kinds of groups are very good at co-opting young radicals to participate. So I'm not sure that the rhetoric of Black Lives Matter, which is very postmodern and, as you say, very internationalist, in any way represents a potential for mass mobilization in the United States itself.
Okay.
Amongst Black people and others. I don't see it. I mean, the protest against police violence, against hyper-incarceration, those are, of course, extremely legitimate and necessary protests. But I don't know that they make social movements that can make political and economic demands on the government, the system, the economy.
Right. I see what you're saying. Are there any thoughts about things you're seeing in this country that's reminiscent of your studies in Germany in the past that you want to talk about?
Well, I think what we are seeing two things. From the liberals, we are seeing an attempt to describe this fascist or semi-fascist system that's developing here as a combination of a lunatic leader and low-class, idiotic crackers and yahoos, to use the American terminology. And this represents one of the mistaken analyses of liberals toward fascism and Nazism. You know, Hitler plus a bunch of rowdy, drunken people. And that's first of all, completely ignores who Trump's cabinet is and what it's about, and the massive reallocation of income upward that it has in mind and has quickly set about accomplishing. So it misses the side of the neoliberal capitalist crisis that has led not trailer parked yahoos and crackers, but lower middle class people, as was the case in Germany at the end of the 20s and early 30s, to look for some security against the claims, on the one hand, the claims of other portions of the working class, in the case of the United States, Black and brown people, and one forgets the centrality of the attack on public sector workers, which has been a part of the right-wing agenda, not just Scott Walker in Wisconsin, but my own Rick Scott in Florida, and everywhere part of the Republican and right-wing agenda. And in some ways, public sector workers in the United States are not a stand-in, but an analog to the organized working class of Germany or Italy in the post-World War I period. And so that's one thing I think we need to keep our eyes on, both the liberal mistaken understanding of what's going on and a look at what is going on, which is a coalition of the most reactionary sections of America's elites with an anxious lower middle class. Now, whether that some significant portion of that anxious lower middle class would have voted for Bernie Sanders, I think the answer is yes, because there is some understanding of the shift of wealth that neoliberalism has brought about, which makes sense to lower middle class and working class people. Everybody has multiple identities. And Trump managed to tap into the ugliest of those identities amongst many Americans. But some very significant portion of those Americans is available, would be available for a progressive understanding of the crisis. And I think that's a challenge before us. It's a challenge that the left did not, by and large, succeed in interwar Europe. But it came close. Some elements of the French Popular Front showed that. It's the challenge we face now.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for your time tonight.
You're very welcome.
And now I want to welcome to the show Dr. Tony Montero, who has been an activist and scholar in the Philadelphia area for many years. Tony, we've seen a significant amount of activity since the election that has been quite unique. And so I was thinking to start out maybe providing a framework based around Black Marxism by Cedric J. Robinson might help develop guidance for where to bring this critique to, because there's certainly strains of Marxism and radical discourse that lend themselves to this "we must oust Trump" sort of discussion.
I would agree with that. I think Robinson's book, which is published, I think, in around 1981, 82, is an initial statement that tries to summarize what is the Black radical tradition, and he locates it in a kind of a Marxism, but a Marxism which is revised through the lens of the struggle for Black liberation and against white supremacy. So the exemplars that he uses as models of this are C.L.R. James, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Richard Wright. I think they are important, and I think the way that he situates them is generally accurate. But I think in the, over 30 years since its publication, that some new thinking has come forward, especially on the Black radical tradition, and especially on W.E.B. Du Bois. I think that new thinking and those new insights can help us to make sense of this moment, which I consider to be a moment of crisis, a moment of existential crisis, in fact, for the system, and perhaps a moment of disintegration and breakdown of the system as we know it.
Right. So, what do you think actually happened on Election Day? Because you've seen a lot of venues like, say, the Communist Party and a lot of these kind of Popular Front-oriented groups screaming to the heavens that it's the rise of fascism.
Yeah. Well, I think they're very wrong on this question that the November 8th election represents the rise of fascism. I think fascists don't necessarily run for political office because they don't have to. They are embedded in the state. I think the process of the fascistization of the state and in many ways society as a whole began as the ruling elite's response to the Black liberation and anti-war and women's and other movements of the people that go back to the 1960s. And perhaps we can frame the discussion of fascism in the context, the historical context of the efforts of the state and the ruling elite to dismantle all of these movements of resistance and revolution of that period, again, the period of the 60s and 70s. So I think that's where it kind of begins. All of the political noise of elections and of the ways that the politicians try to govern is just that, noise. The real essence of rule remains stable, remains the same, and has remained the same over perhaps really now close to 50 years. So I don't think fascists need to run for office. The other thing is, as unacceptable and in many ways unpalatable as Trump is, he was not the worst of the lot in 2016. It is my opinion that the worst candidate was Hillary Clinton. And she was the worst candidate because she is most connected to the deep state and hence those forces of fascism embedded in the deep state. So I don't see the start of fascism with the election of Donald Trump. In fact, Donald Trump's election represents a spontaneous uprising and rejection of the very elite that are embedded in the deep state. Now, of course, that rebellion did not have a positive aspect, so it remains pretty much what it was on November 8th.
Okay. So with these things in mind, it seems that this is a White House that has been fractured and has its own palace intrigues that would make Shakespeare envious.
Yes. And Machiavelli envious. This idea of palace intrigue and, Machiavelli's notion of the processes of the internal power struggles within elites, and Shakespeare's observations upon that as well are quite fitting. But I think what each of them points to in a kind of cryptic way, I might add, is that real power does not rest with elected officials or public officials. And in that regard, real power is not in the White House. We've come to see that now. It is a configuration of institutions and strategic actors that constitute power. And among those institutions, are the security services, CIA, FBI, National Intelligence Agency, and the whole slew of these deep state intelligence apparatchiks that operate in spite of what the White House says or does, but also the corporate media, which is the propaganda arm pretty much of the deep state. And then, of course, those few trusted politicians, be they Republican or Democrat, who are connected in one or another way to these security forces. Now, the other side of this is the transformation of American society over the last 50 years again into a war-fighting society where all of the propaganda, much of the resources of the public go towards fighting war. wars of conquest, wars of suppression, wars of domination. And I would say, in the big sense, what we're looking at is the power of those forces we could generally call hegemonists. More than anything else, their object, their project, is global hegemony and a 1,000-year Reich, if you will. And so that's where the real kind of questions have to be asked. And the whole anti-Trump movement is so obviously connected to various institutions and strategic players within the state that it's not even funny. One questions how the so-called left and progressive forces don't see how closely they are aligned with the very forces that we're talking about, many of whom represent fascism.
Right. Now, one of these embedded fascist elements that has been getting particular notice around Providence because of its high level of migrants is groups like the INS and the various elements of the police state that patrol undocumented workers, and that has a very tangible impact on activism. I'm curious how you think a left should be confronting issues, because the Fraternal Order of Police was very enthusiastic about their endorsement of Trump, and there's a very obvious kind of grassroots level of coordination between these different forces that might not be wholly consented to by the upper echelons. It's more like people, the officers on the street feel emboldened by the outcome of the election.
Yeah, you're right, the INS, but the INS and the anti-immigrant thing cannot be separated from the historic project of white supremacy itself, which, then connects the struggle for immigrant rights to the struggle for black rights. And again, the police state and the militarization of local police forces and the unleashing of them, especially in the black community, and the protection of them by prosecutors and judges and juries is something perhaps unseen in previous decades. We're back to a level of unharnessed police terror against black communities. And this kind of resonates or informs, if you will, the whole anti-immigrant move. Now, police forces are not only structurally and administratively divided between, let us say, SWAT team type forces, intelligence type forces, and that cop on the beat, but is also divided along the color line. There are no, to my knowledge, instances of black cops killing white people or black cops killing white women, as is the case with white cops killing black people and killing black women and children. There is no instance of that. And there are very few instances of even black cops killing black people. So here you have the spearhead of this, white racist groups within local police forces, which suggests to me that at the local level, a division along the color line, along the racial divide, is not too far off in terms of occurring. And this will reflect the division and struggle over the question of racism in the society in general. Black police are not blue before they're black. They're black before they're blue. White racist police are not blue before they're white. Their white racist identity informs what they do in the blue uniform. So this clash along the color line, which is part and parcel, in fact, I would say, shaped the class struggle itself, which again takes us back to Cedric Robinson. This racial context of the class struggle is critical. Now, with immigrants, be they from Mexico and Central America, or be they from South Asian countries or the Middle East, that struggle has to find its way to solidarity and unity with the black struggle, which is the longest consistent struggle in this country and has the deepest roots. There will not be an immigrant struggle that can be successful that is not linked to the black liberation struggle. There will not be a struggle of Muslims that can be successful that is not linked to the black liberation struggle. So I think at the end of the day, the centrality of the struggle for black liberation has to be ideologically and politically recognized by the left and by the people if, in fact, any of these struggles is to achieve success.
Right. Now, one of the elements of the election that has been totally spun in a direction that is disingenuous, putting it mildly, is the black vote and the refusal to just go to the polls has been put in terms of voter suppression, in terms of all sorts of various issues. But I had one African-American friend point out to me, he said, she never apologized for welfare. Hillary Clinton never made any discernible effort to show repentance for what her husband did.
Right.
And you've had some very interesting comments about what that black vote shows us in terms of black politics.
Oh, yeah, Andrew. And this is what the pundits and the pollsters and the journalists and others do not understand and cannot see, because it was assumed by all of them that black people would always vote the way they were told by the black political class, that they had nowhere to go but to vote Democrat. And of course, everybody knows all of the appeals and pressure put on the black voters in 2016 by the political class, up to and including Barack Obama, who said if we didn't vote, it would represent a repudiation of him. Well, I guess it was just that. Donald Trump would have lost the election, I'm certain, had he lost Pennsylvania. And he won Pennsylvania in large measure. I think the most decisive part of him winning Pennsylvania had to do with the black vote in Philadelphia not coming out for Hillary Clinton in the numbers that they came out for Barack Obama in 2012. That was what decided, I think, Pennsylvania. And black folk did not come out to vote. People, commentators say, well, we were unenthusiastic. Well, it was a little deeper than unenthusiastic. It was a rejection of Hillary Clinton and, in some ways, the corporate Democrats and Barack Obama's legacy. That's what, was not voter suppression, because Philadelphia is a Democratic city. The machine did all it could to get out the black vote, and we didn't come out to vote. And besides that, I still don't have the data on this. Trump's number of black votes doubled that of Romney in 2012. It's still minuscule, but it doubled his vote. And I would say the last thing, if we look at the election that just took place here in Philadelphia in May 2017, where the Democrats nominated Larry Krasner, a white progressive, to be their candidate, and pretty much decided who will be the next DA because it's such a heavily Democratic city. Well, the Democratic Party in Philadelphia is pretty much a black party. I would say 70% of the Democratic Party in the city are black. And so Krasner's victory, and it was resounding. He had 18 points ahead of the second place finisher, had to do with black voters. Now, a small turnout, but a larger turnout than in the last DA's race, but nonetheless a small turnout. But it was the black vote voting for a white progressive in a race where there were 7 candidates, one of whom was black. And the black community did not vote for him, although a good part of the black political class and blackness leadership class were advancing his candidacy. What this kind of says to me is that black folk will vote for a progressive, even a race moderate, that is more in line with their positions on wages and poverty and criminal justice, and not just for the black face, or not just for the Democrat who is supposed to be liberal. I'll just end on this. In my mind, in the city of Philadelphia, which decided the outcome in the state of Pennsylvania, black voters not voting, enough of them by not voting, rejected corporate Democrats and Hillary Clinton in the first instance.
Right. Now, one of your major influences, James Baldwin, he writes, Negroes He writes, Negroes know far more about white Americans than that. It can almost be said, in fact, that they know about white Americans what parents, or anyway, mothers, know about their children, and that they very often regard white Americans that way. And perhaps this attitude, held in spite of what they know and have endured, helps them explain why Negroes, on the whole, and until lately, have allowed themselves to feel so little hatred. And so I want to ask, and you can totally push back on this and reject it. Do you think absenteeism from the polls, at least, might have been, well, if you guys want him, you can have him, with regards to Trump, or was it just complete rejection of Clinton? By that, I mean, like, there's a certain point where a parent says, okay, baby's going to touch the stove, and I guess it's got to learn.
I think it's so interesting the way you deploy James Baldwin as a lens through which to talk about political voting behavior, especially in 2016. Just on that quote that you gave, Baldwin said, black people look upon white people, I'm interpreting now, as pathetic, and therefore cannot muster the energy to hate them. Now he didn't say there is no hate, but relatively little hate given the experience that we've had in this country. But I think that the big part of this is his understanding, and I think it's very accurate, that we look upon white people with pathos as a pathetic, not even tragic people. And I think what you just said is true. We've done all we could have done to help move this country in a progressive direction. Now, if you want one of these people, Clinton or Trump, you guys can have them. And I think since the election, that has pretty much been the attitude in the black community. That's why in these big marches, you see very relatively few black folk and hardly any from the working class and from the poor, you know. And in a lot of ways, it is an accurate way of thinking about electoral politics, especially on national level, and especially in presidential races. It's a rigged system. It's a racially rigged system. And I think black folk have, in a sense, drawn back from a lot of the issues of national politics, not because we are disinterested, but because, in a lot of ways, although unarticulated most of the time, we feel that the ball is now in the court of white folk, the white poor, the white working class, the white middle class, and let us see how you handle these contradictions, which are impoverishing you all, are driving you all to suicide and drug addiction and despair. Let us see how you handle this. And we will build within our communities. We will prepare for the worst and hope for the best. I think that's the attitude among black folks.
Right. So prior to the election, you were saying several times over the last year that you thought the country was moving towards a period of ungovernability equivalent to what happened during the Civil War. Do you think we're at that point, or we still got farther to go?
Well, yeah, I think, and I would just add to that, I think the great period in our lifetimes of ungovernability was the 60s and 70s. If you remember, the cities were going up in flames. Anti-war demonstrators were all over the country. The campuses were falling apart. And the question of who could govern. Nixon was driven from office, was on the table. In part, gentrification and the changing of the racial demographics of major cities is an attempt to hold on to the cities in the face of black poverty and unemployment and so on. But I think we are approaching a period of ungovernability. Unlike the 60s and 70s, we have a more intense conflict within the ruling elite, the white governing class. And I think that unlike the 60s and 70s, a lot of the spontaneous chaos will come from the white suburbs and white small towns. But I think the country could become ungovernable, and I think it is almost inevitable that a deepening chaos, in a sense of how would you put it, of not knowing where to go among the elite, will take over the country. I think we're in that kind of right now. I think the Trump presidency is a manifestation of the collapse of the ruling class capacity to govern.
And I think another sign of this, and I could be wrong, is the defeat of John Ossoff last night in that special election.
Interesting. How do you see that?
Well, it seems obvious that the National Democratic Party was pulling resources from every progressive constituency it could find on this on the planet, and he just sunk like a dead weight.
Yeah.
People are just not interested.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I didn't interrupt.
Well, no. It's just people are not interested in these corporate Democrats, and they're not learning their lesson.
Yeah. I think you're right. And you know something, Andrew? Bernie is partially right. I mean, you have to have a jobs program, an infrastructure development program, an anti-poverty program, a Medicare for all, healthcare program, and he's right. But what he leaves out is that you have to have an anti-war program and a peace dividend taken out of the huge and growing military and national security budgets. So that's what you have to do, and that's what the people want, and that's what the people will respond to. And I agree with you completely. They're tired of these corporate Democrats who are not that different from the Republicans that they run against.
Right. And so one of the things you've also previously mentioned is that going back to Du Bois and the wages of whiteness beginning to be eroded due to or manifested by the opiates crisis.
I think the opiates crisis manifests precisely that. I think this ongoing stagnation in wages, in fact, a decline in wages, that when they talk about unemployment being down and the numbers of people in the workforce, well, which is down, but which is a little higher than a few years ago. The fact of the matter is people are working 2 and 3 part-time jobs. Unions are being busted. There is growing poverty among white people. So whiteness is not paying the wages and dividends to white people that were promised and are expected. I mean, and this is a huge crisis because the stabilization of the neoliberal system is based upon being able to give at least something, at least crumbs to white Americans. But those crumbs are no longer coming to them. And, well, they're in a real crisis, a crisis of racial identity, a crisis that is driving them to despair. Now, it would be positive if the crisis of whiteness would drive them toward solidarity with black people. And we have to see if the type of leadership can emerge among the poor white, among the working class whites, that will suggest to them that the only way out of the crisis is in unity with black folk and other racially oppressed groups.
Right. And in that sense, do you see any political formations on the horizon or still in the sphere of activism that have any validity still? I know the Green Party's post-election decisions were pretty controversial, and I was not impressed with how it rolled out in complete method. But do you think there are still elements that have a validity, or we have to start from scratch?
Yeah, see, I just don't know everything that's out there, and I don't think anybody does. But I think the old ways of organizing from the left and from progressives, you know, a lot of people think that the Saul Alinsky method can be applied in this time. Others think that old-style leftism will do it. I'm not convinced of any of that. I am positive about the possibility of spontaneous resistance on the part of white working and poor people and white middle class. But I always go back to the black struggle, because black people as a political force are the most advanced and the most highly organized and the most stable element within the overall people's resistance. So we have to see, I think we're in for a period of spontaneity, which could be followed by a period of mass mobilization and mass organization, but we're not quite yet there.
Gotcha. Are there any points you'd like to bring up in closing?
Not really. I think we've covered a lot. And it's been a real joy talking to you.
That's all we got for the time for today, folks. Thanks for listening, and tune in next time for another episode of Political Gingervitis. I'm your host, Andrew Stewart, and I want to remind you again, America's greatest social democratic period corresponded with the lives of those wonderful commies, Larry, Curly, and Moe.